What up, guys? So, real quick, I had a conversation with somebody, and I guess I don't think what I said landed right. It didn't land the way you know. I guess they wanted it, to. They didn't like what I said or whatever. It kind of rubbed them the wrong way. But that's like some kind. Sometimes you have to say the hard thing, right? And not necessarily the popular thing. And so and you have to be authentic, right? And so, in the time that we live in, it is not a courageous thing to call out an obvious evil. Let me get right to the point, right? It's not courageous to call out the obvious evil. It doesn't make you um, prescient or um, prophetic, or I don't know if that's the word I want to use, but it doesn't make you necessarily a person with intellectual integrity for calling out the obvious evil, right? It doesn't make you courageous. Like saying, for instance, I'll just use it as an example, right? Um, in our present time we live in, people might say, not that I'm taking any sides. Let's just use Trump, for instance, right? So somebody might say, Trump is, you know, not a bad guy for whatever reason, right? Well, I could agree with you, but that wouldn't be. Trump is an obvious evil, right? Let's just say, he is, right? So that would be an obvious evil, right? And so me calling that out while other people are calling that out doesn't make me courageous, right? It doesn't make me necessarily a truth teller, courageous, someone with intellectual integrity, someone who is prescient, right? Edgy or anything like that, right? It is what it is. It's obvious this guy is, doing certain things, or whatever, and then you're talking about it. What makes you courageous is in speech, right? And intellectually honest, right? Is when you're able to say the tough things, right? When you're calling out or talking about um, something that people's, for instance, maybe they're heroes, and they have a idea of someone who is something that they're not, or something that it's not, right? And you find that, what I mean is, like in the political theater or maybe the religious space, people have these people that they look up to, right? Whether it be in Obama, or they have their political gods or their religious gods, right? The Creflo Dollars, or the could be a TD Jakes, or some man in a position that they look up to as this sort of good figure, whatever the fuck that means, right? And so these figureheads that they look up to are not generally what most people think they are. They're just that, figureheads, right? And the image that they portray is basically that. It's just a public relations image. It's not actually, something that they package and sell, right? And so it's those people, right? It's the more acceptable forms of evil, the less obvious forms of evil that may take a little more unemotional, intellectual honesty to talk about. And Well, and it depends. I guess depends on which side of the spectrum you're on, right? Because people get emotionally attached on both sides of the spectrum in life, right? No matter what it is, and you create these psychological biases and about people that don't really exist. These biases about how moral they are when that morality doesn't exist. It only exists in your mind, right? They're perfect or whatever in your mind. And so we tend to justify the evil, right? They say, well, it's the lesser of two evils. It's still evil, right? And when you're doing that, then you become a person that's necessarily biased, and you're not an honest broker. You're not somebody that can have a conversation about certain things honestly. Or no, you're not credible. You're not a credible source, or a person that can be credible in any fashion in a conversation about certain topics when you do that. So, yeah, it doesn't, in this day and age, the courage is not calling out, an obvious form of evil. The courage, a person that shows courage is a person that that speaks truth to power regardless. For instance, I'll give you one example before I go. Helen Thomas. If you don't know who Helen Thomas is, Helen Thomas was the first female press secretary or something, not press secretary, press corps. First female in the press corps. She's also an Arab, right? And she called out, real quick, she called out Obama. She said, when I first interviewed him, I asked him some questions. He lied. I knew he was lying to me because she's in the press corps. Go back and watch the videos. And she said, when he lied to me, when I asked him the questions, I knew he was a coward. I was like, wow. She said this publicly in an interview. And I thought to myself, that took courage for her to say that. Because a lot of people was going to go at her neck for that. A lot of people going to go at her neck for that. For realizing that he was lying to her. And based on the context of the question, she called him a coward. You can go back and watch the interview. You can look for it on Google. And after that, I also kind of followed what she was saying. And she was correct, right? Duke is a coward. And, he's a coward and kind of a weirdo, you know what I mean? And, and some people are going to be offended by that, but it's true. You look at his statements and some of the stuff he's done. He's a very unsavory character. I gotta be honest, right? As far as being authentic, I gotta be honest. Call a spade a spade. And so Helen Thomas was correct in her analysis early, before a lot of people. And so I'm just using him as an example. I'm not picking on him. I know there's going to be a lot of people crying and butthurt because I said that. But not to make this too long. But yeah, she just showed courage, right? To stand up to somebody like that and say that. A person in her position, being the first woman in the press corps, right? Knowing that would make her, kind of a pariah, or, make her marked, for saying that about the so-called first black president. And so that's what I mean. Like, you have to, it's particularly when somebody has this, they try to have this PR image of this person that's squeaky clean when they're not. And it's basically all fluff, right? As opposed to somebody like a Trump who is, visibly, kind of abrasive, right? He's visibly abrasive, right? So we have your obvious forms of evil, so to speak. Doesn't make you courageous to talk about that, but what Helen Thomas did made her more a courageous individual. You see? So anyway, that's all I got. Just want to talk about that. Y'all have a good one.